It is a great pleasure to be able to welcome and introduce Rob Sparrow, who is Professor of Philosophy at Monash University, Australia, but also Chief Investigator in the Australian Research Council Centre of Excellence for Electromagnetic Materials Science, where he works on ethical issues raised by new technologies ranging from robotics to gene technology. He's also co-chair of the IEEE Technical Committee on Robot Ethics and was one of the founding members of the International Committee for Robot Arms Control. Since 2006, Professor Sparrow has explored the ethical issues raised by social robots in a continuous series of articles, many of which have become classics of roboethics, beginning with the issue of deception and self-deception in care robotics to resist dimensions of robot design, to the dilemma raised by killer robots and self-driving cars. Most recently, his work has taken on the double-directedness or Janus-faced character typical of Robophilosophy, while using philosophy to explore in greater detail the ethical aspects of robotic affordances. He also uses robots as research instrument for philosophy and shows that by analyzing human behavior towards robots, we can learn new things about human moral psychology. So before I give the words to Professor Sparrow, I just briefly want to mention you're free to use the chat when you like to interact with each other. For the Q&A with Professor Sparrow, after his lecture, we will simply draw literally a line in the chat, and after that, please insert your questions and we will take them from there. So Professor Sparrow, thank you very much for being with us. We are very much looking forward to your lecture.
Thank you, Marco, for that kind introduction, and thank you for everyone for joining us in this strange virtual world in which we live. I would also like to thank Marco and Joanna for the invitation to present. It's a great honor, and I'm very excited to be a participant in Robophilosophy. Marco, you're looking disturbingly frozen there, however. Can I just, someone able to indicate that they can hear me at this point?
Rob, everybody can hear you.
Excellent, all right, cheers. So thank you for the invitation. It's traditional in Australia to begin a philosophy talk with an apology. So first I'd like to apologize that I'm unable to join you in person. I was so looking forward to this event, and so many of the participants and attendees are people whose work I've been reading and engaging with over the years. I mean, I'm profoundly disappointed that I'm not able to meet you all, but I'm also grateful for the opportunity to participate in this fashion. The other thing I should say is this talk is still, as they say, a work in progress. It's one of those situations where you know that there is an interesting idea out there, but I'm still wrestling with it. And so I'm very much hoping to learn from people's feedback and questions at the end of the talk. So I will share some slides as well. If I can do that, share that, and all right. Okay, so robots were stories before they were machines. They were the golem, the statue that came to life, the mechanical man. They were artificial workers and slaves. They were mechanisms for telling stories. So I want to begin this talk by noting that robots, particularly social robots, but I would say all robots, are machines with meaning. And I mean this in three different senses. First, and I think most of us already know this in our hearts, I mean that the popular enthusiasm for robots, and indeed a lot of the discussion of robots, even by philosophers and engineers, is really about what it means to be human. As machines, robots actually tend to be a little bit underwhelming. And when they work, we tend not to notice them. Your automatic telling machine or your dishwasher is a robot, but it's hard to get too excited about them. What people do get worked up about is the idea of a mechanical person or an artificial person. And the reason why they get worked up about it is because they're wondering what it is that makes us human. This is never clearer than when people start talking about the 3 laws of robotics, which were set out in stories written before there were any robots, as though they were a serious proposal for developing an ethical framework. In fact, it's very clear that they were a structure for generating drama. The so-called laws of robotics allowed Asimov to tell some cool stories, which asked his readers to think about their ethics. And yet people still often mistake these means of generating stories and generating dramas as though they can tell us something about robots instead of telling us something about human beings who like to write and hear such stories. Even with production line robots, it seems to me that they're only really interesting when they provoke a debate about the dignity of labour, the meaning of labour, and the centrality of work to a good human life. Indeed, there's a whole series of anxieties that are driving and being explored in discussions of robotics. For instance, there are some interesting conversations about masculinity and about the relationship between being a man and being someone who works that often take place when people start thinking about the social impact of robots. So I want to suggest that most of the conversations going on about robots today are really arguments about what it means to be human and about what sort of world we want to be living in the future. So robots are machines with meaning in the sense that they are machines that enable us to tell stories that help us think about what it means to be human. Now, the second sense in which robots are machines with meaning is that they're machines that only work to the extent to which we attribute meaning to them. And this is particularly true of social robots. One might even say that social robots are machines that work with meaning. In order to build a robot that is capable of engaging socially with human beings, you have to make sure that people understand your robot's emotions, for instance, and that they respond in the right way to the emotions that they recognise and to the task that the robot is supposed to be performing. HRO is all about this, and Byron Rees's media equation is an article of faith for the profession. So we see engineers making robots modelled on dogs in order to mobilise people's effective responses to these animals in their encounter with a robot. Humanoid and other social robots are given faces with big eyes and exaggerated expressiveness, again so that robots can use their faces to communicate with human beings. The capacity of robots to convey meaning through their bodies and facial expressions is essential to the function of social robots. More generally, the project of designing a robot, particularly a social robot, involves designing the user as much as it does designing the robot. In order for the robot to work, we must also get people to do the right thing, which often means changing their behaviour. Thus, with industrial robots, you need to keep people away from the production line, which usually means restricting the freedom of humans by fencing off the production line so that robots can do their work. So robots are never just machines. They're machines in an ecosystem of relationships between human beings, which means that shaping the behaviour of those who interact with robots is always a key part of the design process. So in that sense, they're also machines with meaning. Finally, robots are machines that have meaning for relationships between people. When robots shape the behaviours of their users and of other people who relate to the robot, they also impose new relationships between people, which means that they are machines with politics as well. And at the end of my paper, I want to offer some observations about the politics of robotics. So the first sort of action call in this paper is for more semiotics in the field of robotics and social robotics. I think we need more cultural studies. I think people need to be thinking harder about the cultural meanings of both robots in general and individual robots. And I think we also need more politics. In particular, we need more attention to the cultural politics of robots. The moment that robots represent things or people they participate in and may be evaluated on the basis of a politics of representation, In some cases, ethical questions may arise concerning the way in which the designers of robots use their capacity to represent things to achieve their goals. That is to say, that robots represent anything at all may be problematic. In other cases, the way in which robots represent people, in particular, and maybe this would arise with other entities, may be problematic. So the issue with representation in itself is a very old traditional philosophical concern. Famously, you have Plato worried about literature giving people false knowledge of the gods because, you know, people think that they have knowledge of the gods when they've only read about the knowledge of the gods. Representation is itself a slippery thing. And this slide between reality and image is essential to it. And for some people, that's essentially deceptive. So it's no surprise that we've seen a debate about the ethics of deception in using social robots. And this is something I've written about in my work on aged care robots. The idea that so many of the functions of social robots rely upon deceiving the user or the person who's engaging with the robot, that the robot has capacities that it doesn't in fact have. If we are to feel cared for or loved or happier as a result of our interactions with Sparrow, the robot seal, in part that's because we think that Sparrow cares about us and is responding to us instead of just being a machine. Now, I'm aware that, as Selma argued last night, a lot of what's going on with Sparrow is actually about relationships between people, that in many contexts, robots are really conversation starters, and their health impacts and impacts on relationships are to do with the way they facilitate relationships between people. But so often people working in the field of social robots will talk about the relationship with the robot itself as producing benefits for the user. And if you push on that and you look at what it is that people have to attribute to the robot in order to receive those benefits, there's a deception involved. And we've also got an image here of Ron Arkin and Alan Wagner and their work on trust in robots and deception in robots. And clearly there's an ethical debate to be had here about deliberately deceiving people, perhaps for their own well-being. For the moment, I just want to foreground the way in which it's the representational content of the robot that it presents itself as something that it isn't, that opens it up to this charge of being deceptive. But there are some specific contexts in which representation via robots is rightly controversial. And so I turn now to the much discussed topic of sex robots and robot sex. I must admit, I'm getting less and less comfortable about displaying these standard images of sex robots that one finds in presentations like this, but bear with me. These, you know, part of what I want to call out here or draw attention to is the cultural politics of the representation of women in sex robots, and indeed in female robots more generally, in the extent to which robots can properly be described as female is itself something I'll be looking at later in this presentation. And again, if you're interested, this is work that I've done in a paper about robots, rape and representation. So there's an obvious question when you look at these images, and I think it's, you know, not sure that the true companion robot ever actually existed. It's quite hard to work out whether that was ever a real product. But to a certain extent, I don't think it matters because it's the media representations of robots as much as the reality of robots that plays a role in generating their cultural politics. So there's an obvious question here about how these robots are representing women. Sex robots, and indeed robots more generally, will convey ideas about how women look or should look, and also ideas about how women should behave. Both of these seem problematic. Sex robots participate in and reinforce a familiar set of sexist stereotypes about women's bodies. Big lips and big breasts abound. They also risk reducing women to their bodies and or their sexuality. And clearly this is something that Kathleen Richardson has drawn attention to in the campaign against sex robots. And at a deeper level, in building an object in the image of a woman, they risk implying that women are objects. Building an object in the image of a woman for the purposes of sex then might not unreasonably be taken to imply that women are fundamentally sex objects, or at least that the most important thing about women is that men can have sex with them. Similarly, when it comes to the behavioural repertory of sex robots, they are good for only one thing. The fact that sex robots are always available for sex might be thought to express the idea that women are, or should be, or always available to serve the sexual desires of men. As well as the way in which these robots represent women, there's also a question about, and this has been of something I've been investigating in my own work, is what sex with robots represents. If sex robots represent women, then sex with a robot arguably represents sex with a woman. But it seems highly unlikely that the users of sex robots will ask the robot for consent before they have sex with it, in which case sex with the robot will arguably represent sex with a woman without consent, and thus rape. Alternatively, if the robot is programmed always to explicitly say yes to sex, or we interpret sex with a robot as representing sex with a consenting woman, then again, sex robots represent women as always available for sex. So there seems to be, if you sort of buy this argument about the representational politics of sex robots, there seems to be an ethical dilemma when it comes to the manufacture of sex robots, is that they either present themselves as being available for rape, or they can't be raped because they're always consenting to sex. And neither of those looks like something that one wants to be implying about women. As with other forms of media, another question concerns who gets to be represented. Most humanoid robots have white surfaces, and where they have skin, this is almost always white skin. While it's an empirical matter whether this means that most robots represent white people, and you know, I really want people to be doing more research on this. So I really, you know, if there's anyone out there who has the capacity to do good human subjects research using robots at the moment, which is hard to do if we're all socially isolated, I'm really hoping that people will do some good anthropology, some good experimentation to try to work out whether people are attributing race to robots empirically. And so I'm interested in things like, you know, do people change the way they talk if you change the surface color of a robot's surfaces? Do you see differences depending upon the racial identity of the person interacting with robots with different surface colors? Do people stand closer to or further away? Do they attribute different properties to robots depending upon their surface colors and facial features? So there's an empirical question here, but if people do respond to robots as though they have this kind of racial identity, and one believes, as I do, that race is fundamentally a social construct, which is not to say that it's not real. Race is embedded in material relationships, it's embedded in geography, it's embedded in our economic structures, but it's also itself a product of racism and sustained by the mutual identification of race. So if race is socially constructed, and and people do attribute race to robots, then it will turn out that robots genuinely do have race. Now, again, this is a topic to which I want to return later in the presentation. And, you know, I'm really trying to dive in and try to investigate the extent to which it is this strong claim that robots genuinely have race is defensible. But it does seem to me that if you combine an account of race as socially constructed with an empirical observation that people respond to robots as though they have race, then it seems to follow that robots genuinely will have race. Now, what race do they have? Well, here we turn to, and I guess I should give a shout out to Louis Jude Sakai's book, The Sound of Culture, which is on this slide, which is a fantastic resource on this question on the kind of racial and cultural politics of robots, including that robot featured there, which was called Rastus the Mechanical Man, as an early Westinghouse robot, right at the beginning of history of robots. And arguably the sort of cultural politics of that robot was to reassure white farm workers that mechanization in farming at the time was not going to deprive them of their cultural privileges. There's a really interesting story to be told about that robot. But if we look at robots, and here we have some, you know, famous robots that people, I take, will be familiar with, they all turn out to have this white, glossy plastic surface. And where they have skin, it's almost always white skin. Now, again, it's an empirical question whether or not people do read this through a racial coding, but it does seem to me that there's strong evidence that people are already thinking about this. For instance, the few cases of people building robots that very clearly have race are some of the Japanese robots that are clearly look Japanese or Asian. There's a couple of other robots that are clearly sort of nationalist projects of national pride that attribute local ethnic and racial identities to robots through their construction. The fact that these robots stand out and that people are making clearly a conscious effort to say, no, this is an Asian robot, this is a Japanese robot, this is a, you know, an Arab robot, suggests that it's at least possible for robots to have race. And then we see that the bulk of robots have this striking white color. So if we, this is from the wonderful anthropomorphic robots database. And I mean, I have actually been through this database and kind of informally coded robots, and their surface colors are almost overwhelmingly white. There is there's another way of interpreting this cultural politics around the notion of the future, that these are robots that are futuristic and the future is glossy and clean, has a kind of 2001 or Star Wars aesthetic. And that's an alternative explanation as to why these robots have the appearance that they do. But interestingly, that of course, that has a cultural politics as well. That idea of the future as white and devoid of dirt and social contamination is itself a racist trope and model of the future. So robots, by virtue of having this capacity to represent, and humanoid robots represent people, seem to overwhelmingly represent white people, except that there's this other history to robots where robots are fundamentally slaves, and that the robot, the foundational meaning of the robot is the worker or slave. And so that gives you that sort of pushes back against the reading of these robots as being white, and suggests they're actually, fundamentally people of color. And again, I don't think I can give a reading, and I do think other people have given readings of the cultural politics of robots, but at some level, this needs to be investigated empirically, and we need to be looking at how people respond to these robots and their race politics. Now, so I've given some examples, and apologies if you're already familiar with these arguments from previous heard presentations on this topic before, or perhaps read some of the papers I'm drawing on here. But I wanted to give examples of why this question of the meaning of robots matters. Because none of this is especially egalitarian, and all of it seems ripe for criticism. One set of worries relates to the implications of such stereotypes for behaviour. Will sex robots encourage men to treat women like objects? Will they make it the case that, that men are more likely to rape women? Will racial stereotypes in robots encourage racism? Now, this, and I'll say more about this, this claim about media effects is very controversial. That, you know, the advertising content, the film content, the books that we read shape our behaviour, which in some sense seems kind of obvious, you would have thought, is actually resisted by people who want to enjoy their horror films and, you know, who note that people consume these media forms without necessarily being driven to replicate the behaviour that they witness. But it is hard to see how you can think that advertising works without thinking that images shape behaviour. And if advertising doesn't work, some of it's very hard to explain why people drink Coca-Cola, or why some of these enormous multinational companies spend so much money on advertising, unless they think that by shaping the images that we consume, they can shape our behaviour. Now, if that's true, the cultural politics of these robots becomes deeply problematic. But I want to distinguish, and this is part of the work in the second half of this paper, I want to distinguish between a claim about the effect of consuming these cultural representations and their content as representations. So you might, independently of the claim that, you know, sex robots are going to make men rape women, you might worry about what these stereotypes communicate or express. Reducing women to their bodies or suggesting that they are always available for sex is sexist and disrespectful, even if it doesn't alter the behaviour of men in the way that the media effects argument suggests. Similarly, excluding people of colour from the future seems racist and offensive, as does representing people of colour as slaves. So again, there's a dilemma here in building humanoid robots, that you make them white, that seems racist, but if you give them surface colours, that makes people racially code them as people of colour. And historically, of course, you know, there's an association between slavery and skin tone that looks problematic and racist and offensive as well. Now, of course, the politics of representation is highly contested, and a salient response to these concerns about the politics of representation of women by robots is to point out that sex robots seem no different in these various regards from representations of women in other media, most obviously pornography, but also much film and cinema advertising. For the most part, the 60s and 70s argument that these sorts of representations are unethical appears to have been lost in most parts of the world today, or at least such images are still being made and consumed without much evidence of controversy. Moreover, later waves of feminists have questioned previous generations' criticisms of pornography and sex work. Sex-positive feminism celebrates sex, female desire and women's bodies, and it is certainly open to someone who's sympathetic to these commitments to insist that this should extend to include robots. So maybe those images of sex robots are in fact images of sex-positive women enjoying their bodies and enjoying sex. I struggle to believe that, I must admit, personally, and there's something about the fact that these machines have no agency, that they are slaves, that they are robots, that makes that reading seem implausible to me. But I do think that there's a kind of moralism in the campaign against sex robots, that there is this sense that, you know, sex is special, that sex is morally coded, and that it shouldn't be in the commercial sphere, unlike other aspects of our daily lives that have been commercialized, including caring labour and including bodywork of various sorts. So there is a debate to be had here about how one responds to the sex industry. And it seems to me that some of these arguments about the cultural politics of robots are vulnerable to the claim that the attitude towards sex and the sex industry that is driving these criticisms is itself a conservative one that denies the agency of sex workers. Though having said that, I also think it's very hard to read sex robots as images of feminist empowerment. I've struggled to come up with a plausible account on the race politics of robots where you might try to sort of recoup or recode the race politics of robots, to which I've been drawing attention, and see those as images of, I don't know, racial pride or, you know, black power. I'm just not, it seems to me that you should be able to make that argument, but I have struggled to make it. I do think that you could argue that the racist, what I've identified as being racist stereotypes in robots reflect rather than produce racism. And so these should be seen as kind of, you know, epiphenomenal on the deeper question of racial justice in society. So it is possible, I think, to say that the very sort of earnest cultural politics that I was advocating for at the beginning of this paper should in fact be complexified. We should understand that these images are capable of being interpreted in multiple ways and shouldn't necessarily be seen as disempowering in the way that I've certainly suggested in parts of my discussion. Moreover, the argument that these images shape behaviour is itself incredibly contested in what's called the media effects literature. And so when it comes to things like video game violence, for instance, it's very popular to say, nope, we all recognise it as being fantasy. It has no, it's just fun. We all play these games. Most of us don't go out and kill people. When first-person shooters, you know, became available in America, the murder rate actually went down. There is nothing to see here. These things don't shape behaviour. Again, hard to reconcile with the history of advertising. But the media effects literature is bitterly divided between the social psychologists who say, of course, this stuff shapes behaviour, and the criminologists and the game studies people who say, no, it doesn't. But interestingly, with robots, because they are these three-dimensional artifacts that are embodied and mobile, engineers, I think, often argue or imply that these are more powerful media. This is a more powerful media form. That robots aren't like films, they're not like books, they're not like images. They have more power to change us than these other media forms. So for instance, people make a strong claim to the value of educational robots, or perhaps the therapeutic value or the supposed therapeutic value of child-sized sex robots, where people say, look, yep, this robot can actually change behavior. It's cathartic. It means that people are less likely to act out their immoral sexual urges. So there's this claim that's made for robots that they're not like, that these are more powerful media form. And that's what I want to look at for the rest of this discussion. One way you might say this is you might say, look, we are just naturally primed to read robots as though they were alive. And because of that, all our cultural filters, all our sort of clever ability to read media and understand the ways in which we're engaging with it, that all goes out the window, and we just think, you know, oh, there's this creature in front of us. We respond to it instinctively because we've been programmed by evolution to do that. And as a result of that, these interactions have more power to shape our behavior than our interactions with other forms of media. And again, I think you sometimes see this when people make claims about the value of robots in education. You also see that, interestingly, in the claim about catharsis, where people say, look, they can shape behavior because they can help people. If one admits that, then one has to be open to the possibility that these things will teach lessons that aren't the lessons that we intend to teach. And that is, that's problematic if these robots are, you know, participating in racist narratives about who lives in the future, or if they're deeply sexist in the way that sex robots are arguably. Now, again, this is an empirical claim. Robots have more power to shape behavior. I don't have any particular insight on that. It's a hard thing to work out, given that the media effects literature is still arguing about the impact of, you know, pornography or violent video games. I don't have much hope in the short term that someone is going to be able to prove that robots are somehow different or not. So I want to leave that here, and now I want to talk in the closing section of this discussion about robots as icons, because even if they don't have more power to shape behavior than other forms of media, they embodied in mobile nature might mean that they communicate or express more, or communicate or express things in a different way than do other media forms. Now, this is actually quite a, it's a hard distinction to keep open. People, when they talk about meaning, always want to talk about behavior. I want to separate out the question of what robots mean from the question of whether or not they shape behavior. And in having opened that gap, it does seem to me that you might even make the argument about the media equation, about us being evolutionary primed to read robots as though they share a social world with us, to suggest that that means that what robots mean or express is more powerful, that they mean it more than other media forms. But there's another argument here. And this is, I think, this is where the paper gets a bit sketchier, in part because I need to go away and study my semiotics more. But it does seem to me that one of the things that's going on with robots is that they are functioning as icons. Now, an icon is a particular sort of symbol. It's a symbol that works by having the property that it attributes. Now, there's at least two literatures on icons. Charles Peirce wrote many papers in his semiotics on where he distinguishes the icon, and he gives this account of the icon as a special form of sign that has the property that it means. But there's also the history of religious icons. There's also the history of, sorry, I'm not reading the chat at the moment, so my apologies for that. I'm just trying to even get the chat panel up, which is a bit beyond me at the moment. Okay, thanks. All right. I will read that in a moment when I pause for breath, I'm afraid. I haven't been responding to the chat. So these icons, religious icons, I mean, in the most powerful form of the religious icon, the most powerful form of the religious icon, God actually enters into the icon, and the icon is, actually has the properties of holiness or God's, power or compassion. Now, interestingly, I think there's an element in the cultural politics of robots where they have that they function as magical instantiations of us, and I'll come back to that in a moment. So maybe these robots have, when robots have, for instance, breasts, for instance, and Sophia, the robot, why do female robots have breasts? They don't breastfeed. They're not going to raise young. Why robots should have breasts at all is a kind of mystery. But when a female robot has breasts, it represents a woman as having breasts by virtue of having breasts. And perhaps when a robot represents people as having race, it does so because it has the color and the racial codes that it attributes to people. So icons function by instantiating the properties that they attribute. And by virtue of doing that, they're a more powerful form of symbol than other forms of representation. Now, can I get the religious argument to work? Well, there is a sense, I think, that we understand robots as, because they're so caught up in this debate about what it means to be human, that the robot is the kind of, think of the robot as the mechanical man, so often the man. Then the robot as a mechanical man is supposed to be, the spirit of man in a machine, as it were. And so the properties of the robot then become the properties of men, or, and men are supposed to be all human beings. So there is an element here of the way in which religious icons work, where you get this kind of magical instantiation of properties in the robot, which are then work to attribute those properties to the thing that the robot represents. Now, there are questions about icons. The whole notion of an icon as a distinctive form of symbol is up for grabs. Every object resembles every other object in some sense. So, why we look at icons and we note some properties and not others is partially a function of a community. And so if icons really do rely upon interpretation by the community in this way, then maybe they're not as distinctive from other signs as Pierce thought. And there is part of me that does want to resist this, this notion that robots could have race, or that they could have sex. And it depends here on whether you are reading the robot as a robot, or whether you're reading it as a mechanical person, I guess. And again, there's a question here about the extent to which, when one turns to an interpreter or a community to try to settle this question, whether one should be looking to the average member of the community or to the linguistically competent language user. And they will give you different accounts of the meanings of robots. So I'm trying here to offer one provocative model of how robots might mean more than other signs that doesn't rely upon the media effects claim. And clearly there's more work to be done here, and part of what I need to do is delve deeper into the semiotics and to think about this question of whether, when one looks at, say, Bina 48 in that slide, which is a robot modeled you know, on an African-American woman, whether what one sees is, you know, a robot or whether one sees an African-American woman, because the latter clearly has race. It's not so clear whether the robot does. Now, why does any of this stuff matter? Well, I think it matters because, as I argued at the beginning of the paper, the robots shape our relationships. Part of what makes them machines with meaning is that they're shaping our relationships. And if they're shaping our relationships, we need to pay attention to the way that they're doing it. And so the question of who designs these robots is itself then becomes up for cultural grabs. That if engineers are shaping the future and they're shaping the meanings of key concepts like race and sex, and they're shaping them using these very powerful media forms, either because they have more power to shape our behavior or because they communicate more by virtue of being icons, then we need to pay attention to that cultural politics, and we need to be able to contest the nature of the future that is being built for us.